I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Dr. Stace, may I ask you as follows, in terms of the Inquiries Act 2013, do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms Jones.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Is your full name Hilary Janet Serena Stace?
Yes.
And you've prepared a statement for the Commission? Mm-hmm. And have you found it at tab 12 in the folder in front of you, and you've signed and dated it?
12, yes. Yes, I have. So I'll
Yes.
start?
Yeah. Probably a yes would be good. Thank you. And Dr. Stace, you have a PowerPoint that you would wish to use as you read your statement. May it please the Commission, we will produce that as an exhibit, as it has some additional material not in the written brief.
Yes, but most of it is just summaries of my points. It just makes it easier for me to go through my presentation.
Thank you.
So that will be Exhibit 7.
And is it going to work?
And Dr.
Stace,
yes. Just before you start reading, you've asked to read your brief of evidence. So just before you start that, can you confirm, please, that any third parties that you refer to are either sourced from public or you have the consent of the people to speak about them?
Yes.
Thank you. If you'd like to start reading at paragraph 1. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora, everybody. It's been a long road to get to this point. For many of us, it's been a long, long journey of advocacy to get here, so it's a great privilege. I just wanted to start with my own expertise in this area. I'm the mother of a disabled adult son, and he's from the first generation not to be institutionalised and the first to have the right to an inclusive education. I was trained as a historian and a librarian, and I did honours research on eugenics in New Zealand. My 2011 PhD was in public policy at Victoria University, and the subject was the policy challenge of autism. In 2013 and 14, I had 2 short contracts with the Human Rights Commission to work on historic abuse in state care, and as a result organised a roundtable of interested parties on this topic. I'm a writer, a teacher, an activist in disability rights, history, ethics, research and advocacy, and my current status is actually an adjunct professor at the Health Services Research Centre at Victoria University, which is actually an honorary role. Doesn't actually mean much. But slow down, yes. According to Te Ao Māori, we walk backwards into the present and future, bringing those who came before us their battles, knowledge and suffering. We honour them and learn from their stories. In previous work at the Human Rights Commission, we used the whakatauki, Te tiro whakamuri, haere whakamua. Ask the old path for directions to the new path. We need to know our history in order to address it and help us understand why certain groups were locked away from communities and families for who they were rather than anything they had done. As disability advocate Robert Martin asks, how can humans treat other humans like that? This paper mainly covers 2.1 1 of the scope of investigation, but also addresses 2.2, 2.4 and 3.1. It covers the background to the development of the psychopedic institutions, the political, scientific and social environment that encouraged extreme discriminatory practices against certain groups of people, and the legacy of that.
We might skip paragraph 3
Yes.
because that's a repetition,
Yes.
and if you can go to paragraph 4.
Yes,
Thank you.
so the Royal Commission's focus is 1950 to 1999, but this paper reviews the social and the legal, medical and attitudinal context in New Zealand since the mid-19th century that enabled such abuse to happen, and it also looks at ongoing disability abuse and restorative processes required. There were 2 official inquiries in the 1950s that sought to control the defective, the deviant and the delinquent, which were the interchangeable fears of conformist New Zealand in the 1950s when this inquiry's time period starts. When I was a baby, my father was appointed to the Government Special Committee on Moral Delinquency in Children and Adolescents, which produced what was known as the Mazengarb Report in 1954. In an era of moral panic, the intention was to control this potentially deviant phenomena of teenagers in the new state housing suburbs such as Nainai near Wellington. The committee rushed its hearings so that the report could be sent to each household for the National Government's re-election campaign. My father was head of the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce. Judge Mazengarb told Prime Minister Sid Holland that the committee members didn't need to be paid, so my father attended the full-time committee while parenting his growing family and keeping his small business going. Meanwhile, my sister shared the evidence presented to the committee, such as Mickey Spillane novels, with her school friends. The committee decided that the best way to prevent such deviance was to keep young people ignorant. So we got new censorship laws, and one recommendation that took decades to overturn was that under 16-year-olds must not have access to information about contraception. This fear of young people and their potential delinquency also led to the rise of state boys and girls' homes. A few years after the Mazengarb report, the Apuni Boys' Home was opened in Nainai, in the heart of the new suburbs where the committee had located such threat. In this Royal Commission, we're hearing a lot about the long-term effects of abuse from such homes. But more significantly, for disabled people and families, was that the previous year, 1953, another government report responded to the fear of deviance by recommending that disabled children should be locked away from their families and communities in larger numbers than ever before. The 1953 Aitken Report, or the Consultative Committee on Intellectually Handicapped Children, recommended extending the existing psychopedic institutions, such as Templeton, Levin, Kimberley, Braemar, Ngāwhatu, there's a mistake there, it's actually Braemar, which was the psychopedic one, and Mangere, into large mental deficiency colonies, quote, with parents encouraged or coerced into sending their disabled children to them by the age of 5. These recommendations were despite pleas from the newly formed Intellectually Handicapped Children's Parents Association, the IHC, founded 70 years ago this month, and I honour those parents. But the World Health Organization had, their current advice at that time was for community facilities and support for disabled children and adults, not locking up. But the Aitken report is a significant reason why we have a Royal Commission today. As a result of this report, the institutions were extended and numbers of residents rapidly increased. By 1972 and the establishment of the Royal Commission on Psychiatric and Psychopedic Hospitals, which would eventually recommend their closure, each institution was home to hundreds of disabled children, young people and the few adults who had managed to survive. A 1964 documentary estimated that 1 in 1,000 children had an impairment which required their institutionalisation. Smaller units were attached to some local hospitals, while other children ended up in adult psychiatric hospitals. To deal with these growing numbers, the new profession of specialist psychopedic nurse, which you've heard about before, was developed in New Zealand of in-house training. The first cohort graduated in 1964. The normalisation of institutionalisation of disabled children was hard for individuals to fight. I heard of a mother who had a baby with Down syndrome in the 1960s. The family doctor and her husband suggested the baby be put into an institution. The mother resisted until one day the father came home with the GP and an attendant from Kimberley. They forcibly took the toddler off his mother, told her not to visit for at least 2 years, and to forget about him. Terrified and confused by such instruction, the mother didn't hear about him again until after his death a few years later. This powerlessness by mothers was hard for us maybe to understand now. As noted already, this topic is also personal to me as I have an adult son with autism and learning disability. Christchurch filmmaker Gerard Smythe has made 2 powerful documentaries about the closure of Templeton Institution. The residents he filmed over a decade ago were much like the older versions of my son's Special Olympics friends. So most of the interviewees in his documentaries were estranged from families and puzzled as to why they were there. My son was born in the 1960s when institution closures were already underway. So as I mentioned, we are the lucky first generation of parents for whom an institution was not suggested as a suitable place for him. I wasn't told he would be better off in one. He wasn't forcibly separated from his family or community. His impairment is not blamed on me or a cause of shame for the family. Both assumptions were common only a few decades ago. The 1953 Aitken report it didn't come out of anywhere. New Zealand has in New Zealand we have a long and toxic mix of colonisation, racism and eugenics, in which many poor, Māori or disabled people had no chance of equal citizenship. The antecedents of institutional abuse and state care developed over many decades, and I will attempt to explain why disability was, and still is, viewed negatively. 19th century New Zealand was settled by immigrants mainly from Britain and Europe, who endured a lengthy sea voyage for a chance of a better life in a new country. 2 groups which threatened that vision in the popular mind were disabled people and people from Asia. Although infectious illness and accidents were common, disability was unwelcome as it challenged the ideal of a new society and was a burden on others in a time when hard physical work and self-reliance were highly valued. Support was left to the benevolence of families or charitable aid. The Immigration Acts that restricted the entry of Chinese in the late 19th century also sought to deter disabled people. One was the 1882 Imbecile Passengers Act, which attempted to ban, and these are quotes, cripples, idiots, lunatics, infirm, blind, deaf and dumb, and required a bond from the ship's captain for each of these, quote, undesirables. And the 1899 Immigration Restriction Act banned the, quote, idiot, the insane and the contagious. And incidentally, in 2019, we still have immigration restrictions against disabled people. Mental illness, as now, was generally feared and misunderstood. The 1846 Lunatics Ordinance provided incarceration of the mentally ill, initially in jails. The first public lunatic asylum was opened in Karori in 1854, followed by Porirua in 1887. The Porirua asylum mixed several categories of these, quote, undesirables, those with mental health issues, intellectual impairment, alcoholics, as well as elderly and homeless people. Physically disabled people were often also housed in the so-called chronics wards in ordinary hospitals. For decades, all these inmates also provided large captive communities for doctors and specialists to practice theories and treatments. As New Zealand society developed, children came to be regarded as more than just little adults. The 1877 Education Act provided free secular primary school education. The Act's aim was an educated workforce, while enabling state surveillance of children. Rules and inspections were rigid. Segregated residential schools developed at this time too for those with vision and hearing impairments. But deaf children were forced to be oral and punished for signing for most of the next century. The rise of the pseudoscience of eugenics and social Darwinism became very influential. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his bestseller, On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. The ideas of evolution, genetics, heredity, and the potential of selective breeding in humans, not what Darwin has talked about, that to breed out these undesirable characteristics. These were taken up by his cousin Francis Galton, who named this new science eugenics. The application of social Darwinism found fertile soil in New Zealand, as well as other countries. Here, these ideas were embraced by liberals and conservatives, concerned about the white middle-class birth rate, which had started to decline in the late decades of the century, and their consequent fears of losing their racial and moral supremacy. Improving racial, quote, fitness was vital. By the turn of the 20th century, many of New Zealand's leading politicians, doctors and academics believed the scientific validity of eugenics. It was cutting-edge science. We were also, as New Zealand, proudly part of the British Empire and its mother country, or home, as a lot of people called it. The eugenic targets of this population, the white population, were those considered immoral and dangerous, and who threatened racial fitness. In New Zealand, disabled or mentally unwell people and Chinese people were the main targets. Hence, the poll tax and immigration restrictions, which I mentioned earlier. In 2002, Prime Minister Helen Clark formally apologised to Chinese New Zealanders. Disabled people are still waiting. Two influential social Darwinists were Dr. Duncan McGregor and Robert Stout. McGregor from Scotland was Professor of Mental and Moral Science at Otago University and advocated in the 1870s for the extension of the definition of insanity to include, quote, hopeless drunkards, hopeless criminals, and hopeless paupers, so that these dangerous classes might be, quote, made to work for their support and deprived of liberty until they die, in order to prevent their injuring society, either by their crimes or by having children to inherit their curse. In the 1880s, Premier Robert Stout, a former student of McGregor, who believed moral failings caused poverty, warned of an emerging class of permanent paupers, poor people, which could pollute the new society. His wife Anna was a prominent suffragist. Many feminist writings of the era also reflected strong eugenic beliefs, particularly as a means to rid society of undesirables such as alcoholics. In 1903, W.A. Chappell, who was a respected politician and doctor, published his influential booklet, The Fertility of the Unfit. The problem he saw was the decline of the fertility of the, quote, fit, and the increasing birth rate of the, quote, unfit. His solution lay in encouraging the fit to have more children and sterilisation of the unfit. And those included those with mental, moral and physical defects. And I remember when I was a young librarian at the Turnbull Library coming across this book, and it was in a big collection of books and pamphlets, and I was shocked because I didn't know New Zealand had this, that basically fascism was so popular in New Zealand at that time. So it's a shocking book, and yet he's an influential, very, very influential booklet it was. The Eugenics Education Society was founded in Dunedin in 1910 with a membership of politicians, public servants, scientists, doctors, ministers of religion and academics, one of whom was Truby King, the medical superintendent of Seacliff Asylum. They linked intellectual impairment and some physical impairments like epilepsy with inferiority and moral degeneracy. Now, a note here about positive and negative eugenics. Negative eugenists sought to limit fertility, while positive eugenists supported interventionist policies to increase population fitness. In this context, Truby King founded Plunkett in 1907. He was a positive eugenist who believed that teaching mothers the strict rules of scientific mothering would increase the fitness of the race. Committees of middle-class women then took the ideology to the breeding populace. But surveillance of those deemed dangerous and deviant required legislation. And so one of the most significant of these new laws was the 1911 Mental Defectives Act, which classified the groups of other into 6 categories: persons of unsound mind, mentally infirm, idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded and epileptics, and each category had a description and what should happen to each one of those groups. And then the 1914 Education Act required parents, teachers and police to report mentally defective, quote, children to the Department of Education, and the school medical service was founded to identify defective children so they could be subject to surveillance. Health camps developed to temporarily remove children from their families and instill ideals of health and fitness. And the new science of IQ testing provided a valuable classification tool. By a 1922 committee, a government committee on venereal disease, was led by William Triggs, a member of the Legislative Council. His concluding remarks expressed concerns with the role of feeble-minded, quote, women infecting men, causing debauchery and corruption. So here we had another era of moral panic, and it was high. And so Mr. Triggs was appointed to chair a committee of inquiry into mental defectives and sexual offenders. Its 1925 report reinforced the links between intellectual impairment, moral degeneracy, and sexual offending in the public mind. And I just had, there's a little quote from that report, the recommendations. The unchecked multiplication of the feeble-minded and epileptic is leading to a continually growing addition to the sum of human misery, an ever-increasing burden on the state, and the serious deterioration of the race. That was a government report. Theodore Gray was a Scottish clinician, influential in New Zealand's psychiatric hospital administration. He advocated villas instead of the old multi-storey hospitals. In 1927, he succeeded Truby King as head of the Department of Mental Hospitals. To protect this white racial fitness, he wanted segregated farm colonies for those with intellectual disability or mental illness, registration, screening, and sterilisation. And these were all proposed in the 1928 Mental Defectives Amendment Bill. After much political debate, sterilisation was rejected under the leadership of opposition Labour MP Peter Fraser, who would become Prime Minister a decade later. He was a rare voice against eugenics, possibly because of his own family experience of mental illness. As a compromise, a eugenics board was set up to keep lists of mental defectives. Peter Fraser's wife, Janet, one of the first women JPs, was appointed to this board, and I like to think she quietly sabotaged it, as it didn't last long. And French-born nun Suzanne Aubert, who had a personal experience of a disability, was another opponent of eugenics. She founded her home for incurables in Whanganui in 1899, and in 1907 opened her first home of compassion for needy or disabled adults or children in Wellington. So even though eugenic sterilisation was never legal in New Zealand, it's where we know there's a lot of evidence and anecdote that they were widespread, and they were diagnosed in operations such as appendectomies. And witnesses have a lot of anecdotal information about that happening. Something that we need to do more research on. Under the 1928 Mental Defectives Amendment Act, children could be taken off families. A mother provided a rare voice of protest about Dr. Gray's proposed travelling clinics, which would examine intellectually impaired children. And there's this poem that I found that was apparently also a nursery rhyme. It's not going. Anyhow, I'll read it to you. Oh, there he is. Oh, mother, save me from Dr. Gray, 'cause teacher says he's coming today, and if I'm stupid, he'll take me away. Oh, mummy, save me from Dr. Gray. I cannot save you, my little child, his mummy said, and her eyes were wild. You belong to the state, you're no more my child. But oh, my darling, don't stupid be, or he'll say we've tainted a heredity and must be eradicated, you and me. This overview has shown how and why, over several decades, intellectual impairment and disability came to be linked with immorality. Reproduction of these so-called degenerates threatened the dominant white, fit, so-called society. But there was still the legal requirement for education. So in 1908, Otakaiki Campbell Park School, near Oamaru, was opened as a residential school for, quote, feeble-minded boys, and in 1916 a residential school for, quote, feeble-minded girls, Salisbury, was opened near Nelson. These special schools were run by the Education Department. The overall effect of these influential beliefs was exclusion of the, quote,
Dr. Stace,
yes?
Can I intervene simply to ask you to speak just a little more slowly? The signers are finding your pace quite exacting.
The overall effect of these influential beliefs was exclusion of these groups from mainstream society. Girls and boys' homes, farm and residential schools, and other institutions were developed to keep the sexes apart and, importantly, prevent reproduction. Some were built on the sites of orphanages or industrial schools as more permanent placements for those who threatened racial fitness. The 1928 Mental Defectives Amendment Act led to the establishment of our first psychopaedic institution, Templeton Farm Mental Deficiency Colony, in 1929, under the authority of Dr. Gray and his Mental Hospitals Department. It was near Christchurch, but not too close. The first residents were boys, but soon girls were sent there too, although sexes were strictly segregated inside the institution. Christchurch filmmaker Gerard Smythe, he's recorded stories of the residents before it closed in 1996 and caught up with some of the residents again in 2004. Some had been in Templeton for decades, but didn't know why. Some had arrived by bus as small children. Dr. Gray personally signed some of the admission forms. Featured in his 1996 documentary was an older man who had been a Templeton resident from the 1930s. I recently talked to his nephew about the ongoing impact on their family history. 80 years later, this younger man wonders why it all happened. In the documentary, the Templeton resident says he was sent away from where he lived with his mother in the 1930s because he stole 2 pies. He was only a small child. He was initially sent to Otakaki and then Templeton. He describes regular sexual abuse by the, quote, big boys, and lack of any accountability by authorities. He and another boy ran away and for punishment were beaten, then forced to spend several hours a day in a small dog kennel. As a child, the nephew remembers occasional visits home from Templeton by the older man, but the boy was warned to keep away because the older man was rumoured to be, without any evidence, a paedophile. The younger man remembered his uncle would flinch if someone came too close, as if to avoid punishment, and this reflects the reported Kimberley cringe of patients, the residents of Kimberley that Bridget mentioned. In relating this story, the man expressed anger at the older man's mother, his grandmother, for not only sending her son away as a child, but also refusing to accept him home when the institution started emptying. But thinking of that poem I read earlier, the poverty of the 1930s, the mother would have had little power to fight the authorities when they came for the young shoplifter. As well, mother blaming for conditions like autism remained strong into the 1970s and even beyond. Institutionalisation and the consequent shame and fear that the family experienced has affected this whānau for generations. Over time, more psychopaedic hospitals were established, including Braemar, Kimberley, Levin, and Mangere in Auckland. Residential units were established in hospitals, such as Dannevirke, or in psychiatric hospitals, such as Porirua, which set up an autism unit in the 1970s, when that diagnosis started increasing. Many disabled children spent time in mainstream psychiatric hospitals, and some examples can be found in the DBI report that was mentioned earlier. And Pukeora was an institution for children and young adults with physical impairment, which was opened, was in near Dannevirke, opened in the 1950s. So support for eugenic policies was widespread globally, and it was in this context in 1939 that a German father asked the state authorities in Germany to kill his disabled child. That was the start of the euthanasia policies of the Nazis, and it is estimated that over 200,000 disabled people were killed in what is known as the, quote, silent Holocaust. But support for eugenic policies dimmed in New Zealand and elsewhere, but did not die with the Nazis. As mentioned earlier, children with impairments, including intellectual learning disability, founded the forerunner to the IHC. They wanted schools and community facilities for their children so they could keep them at home and out of institutions. But they faced much discrimination. Oriental Bay residents petitioned against the planned school that the IHC had organised there. The residents of Oriental Bay lobbied the new national government for support. They petitioned against the planned school, and the residents lobbied the new national government. I've lost my place there, but the discrimination, the school never went ahead. The whole idea went away because the residents of Oriental Bay didn't want the idea of having a school for children with intellectual disability. And these parents kept lobbying, and what happened is that they wanted these community facilities, but what happened instead is they got this Aitken committee, which was set up in 1954 that I mentioned right earlier on, and it was called the Consultative Committee, and under Dr. Aitken, who was himself at the Otago Medical School, and he was also the father of a disabled child. But instead of the committee, instead of what the parents want, which was community facilities, schools, occupation centres, all those sort of things, what happened instead is that the Aitken report recommended expanding the institutions and with parents to send their children there by the age of 5. And then we had this huge expansion and institutionalisation over the next 2 decades. Even though then, 1959, there was another report.
Could I just ask you
to slow down? Yes, slow down. Sorry. 1959, another report by Dr. Burns of the British Medical Association supported the parents' earlier call for community facilities, but it was hard to turn the juggernaut around. The 1964 National Film Unit documentary, One in 1,000, I mentioned earlier, it shows well-dressed children participating in a variety of interesting activities at Kimberley, although the voiceover is chillingly ableist. However, this official view contradicts that of Robert Martin, who was at Kimberley around that time. His memory is of, despite some good staff, boredom, rigid routines, lack of education, denial of identity, including clothes, possessions, and culture, and neglect and frequent abuse. This documentary illustrates how easy it was to spin a good news story to reassure parents and the public, and why even official visitors didn't notice carefully hidden abuse. Years later, the confidential forum for former inpatients of psychiatric hospitals heard about the backwards of the institutions as places of horror and threat, of adults and children living together in distressing conditions and unconsented sterilisations. So, by the 1970s, thousands of children, young people and adults were locked up in the network of psychopedic and psychiatric hospitals, residential schools and youth justice homes throughout the country. Robert Martin's biography, Becoming a Person, which is here, and he'll be speaking next week, he has more valuable insights into institutionalisation. He'll talk himself, but his experience, he was soon after he was born in 1957, he was labelled retarded, and he was sent to Kimberley. He also had time in other institutions and also extremely abusive foster care, and also had a stint in Lake Alice. Robert remembered some kind staff at the places he was sent to, but the harsh institutional life was frequently abusive. But, as he says, at least he could walk, talk and fight back, unlike some of the others. And when Robert reached 15, the state tossed the angry teenager out of care. He had been denied not only human rights, but culture and identity. A 2009 60 Minutes documentary called Shock Treatment told the sad story of a group of unlucky girls placed in residential state care who were suddenly all apparently diagnosed with epilepsy and put on an experimental cocktail of strong drugs with ECT as punishment, all without their consent or even knowledge. This was at Fareham House in the Wairarapa. Eventually the management changed and the treatment ceased, but the long-term effects remain severe for many of them as reported in the documentary. There are also rumours of unconsented LSD trials at Ngāwhatu and Braemar. I would not be surprised, as institutionalised children and adults have long been used for drug and medical experimentation, such as with polio in the United States. Unconsented cadavers from Seacliff were provided to the Otago Medical School. It would be really good if the Commission could research these rumours of egregious breaches of medical ethics. Meanwhile, truant or misbehaving children, mostly boys, and often Maori, as young as 7, and many having what we would probably now recognise as learning or neurological disabilities, could be picked up by the authorities and deposited in one of the many children's homes, such as Apuni. And we've heard how that was often the first step through lifelong incarceration. But many disabled children did not live long enough to become adults. While doing my PhD research, I heard from an elderly man who told me his sister with Down syndrome was sent away and not spoken about because if anyone found out about the family's bad genes, other family members would not be able to find partners. A woman told me that those with autistic children face significant discrimination, as popular theories blamed refrigerator mothers for their autism. They found it hard to get community acceptance or fundraise. The deinstitutionalisation movement started in the 1970s, but only in 2006 did Kimberley, the last one, close after a March on Parliament. I urge people to visit the old Porirua Hospital Villa, which is now a museum. There are displays of innovative, quote, treatments such as ECT and insulin. The seclusion room where young people were often held and its straitjacket are still terrifying. I hear it's under threat of closure. It's something else that the Royal Commission should stop, as it's provides vital evidence of what happened. Now, my next part of my evidence was on Maori and Pacifica, but it's not an area of expertise of mine, and others have covered it and will do so. Anecdotally, Maori children were disproportionately affected by disability abuse. We know that. There's also a need for more research about disabled Pacifica children in the institutions. So, changing tack a bit, getting it onto what constitutes abuse, that has already been mentioned. And it takes many forms, and it includes physical, any behaviour threatening physical safety or bodily integrity; sexual, anything non-consensual, illegal or inappropriate; emotional or psychological, including threats or bullying or undermining; segregation from friends or partners; neglect, such as lack of access to medical treatment; control and restraint, including medical restraint or medical experimentation; financial, stealing or withholding money; cultural, excluded from ethnic, family or popular culture; demeaning, for example, photographs of institutionalised residents without their consent; witnessing abuse; and silencing, so that victims are unable or unwilling to complain. A 2013 report by Michael Roguski provided evidence of abuse of disabled people living in the community, so not in institutions, either in residential homes or similar. This is just one area. He examined disability support in the Gisborne area and talked to disabled people, families and advocates. He found a number of structural issues, including a low level of societal awareness of disability abuse, a variety of silencing processes, a lack of appropriate monitoring, poor management practices, inadequate reporting, and inadequate legislation, including no protection or support for the disabled person during an investigation of abuse. The silencing The silencing he found was particularly worrying. For the disabled person, it meant pressure not to report, and not to report the abuse because of various reasons. And also the sad reality that an abusive care worker is better than no care worker. Disabled people feeling they were unworthy of good care or deserving of abuse. Normalisation of poor treatment. Difficulties in communication. For example, the disabled person not non-verbal or minimally verbal. Undermining of the disabled person's testimony, and collusion by authorities to protect the perpetrator. And a 2012 survey of disability abuse in California showed a similar picture. And the authors of that survey conclude that abuse is prevalent and pervasive and happens repeatedly to victims with all kinds of disabilities. I would like the Royal Commission to recommend a similar New Zealand-wide survey in which disabled people receiving services are free to answer anonymously with independent support, without providers present. Some recent examples, so this is post, again, out of the post institutions. Now this is Ashley. Hard talking about Ashley. When we had the 1992 Mental Health Compulsory Care and Assessment Act was supposed to end abuse, that with the new processes. Instead, the Act provided a new catch-all diagnosis of mental disorder, which was the justification for locking up young autistic man Ashley Peacock for over a decade. After many long stretches of months in seclusion, mysterious injuries, including the one in the photo, and years of parental advocacy, he was finally released into community care in 2018. Media attention got him out, but the years of incarceration have had a negative effect on him and his parents. But he's not an isolated case. I have a friend who's got a high needs daughter, and she's often told, even by family members, to put her daughter in an institution. Not there are any institutions or even any respite care that are appropriate for her. And her mother wants to keep her at home. So untrained, unskilled carers come regularly into the house. And I have seen and heard from her how some bring demeaning, ableist attitudes. One-to-one care can mean, allegedly, no spoken interaction, locking the young woman in one room for hours without food, drink or toilet breaks, deleting her favourite television programs, taking her possessions and even hitting her dog. So that's recent now. Nothing in so-called disability support shocks me, now or in the past. And disabled people are still suffering abuse despite a whole series of reports. We had a 2008 Select Committee report, big long inquiry for a couple of years. We had a 2013 Ministry of Health report, the Russell report. We've got ongoing media stories, Health and Disability Commission investigations, a 2011 Ministry of Health report reported that life expectancy for people with intellectual learning disability was about 20 years less than for those without. The Donald Beasley Institute and did a whole lot of work around the 2003 to have an ordinary life report about how we could improve things. So New Zealand, as it's obvious, has a much longer history of disability abuse than just 1950 to 1999. A fully restorative approach, including an official and unconditional apology from the top, may help heal and ensure no more are harmed. This is a good example of an apology. It's the 2001 from Prime Minister Helen Clark to some of the victims of abuse at Lake Alice. And what she said was, whatever the legal rights and wrongs of the matter and whatever the state of medical practice at the time, our government considers that what occurred to these young people was unacceptable by any standard, in particular the inappropriate use of electric shocks and injections. And what I like about this one is it challenges the common arguments that what happened was norm for the time. Well, it wasn't. And it happened a long time ago, so it's no longer relevant. It's still relevant. And I'll just skip over the next part, which is there's the best practice for an official apology, but I don't think we've quite got to that point yet. And the restorative practices are only just beginning. So what I'd like to just talk a bit more about how care can be transformed and what it, for me, is, no, what do I want? I want the one on, not that. Sorry about this. I don't want those ones. I want the one of ableism. Oh, too bad. I'll just read it out. It's so what we have to do is address ableism. That one. Thank you. And ableism is what we're facing in all of this. And disability activist and academic Fiona Kumari-Campbell, she's described ableism. She says that it projects a particular kind of self and body as essential to be fully human, one that is fit, active and healthy. Disability is thus cast as a diminished state of being human, and should the opportunity present itself, be ameliorated, cured or eliminated. Under these circumstances, persons with severe impairments often trigger responses such as fear, revulsion or confusion, and assumptions that their disabled person's life must be terrible and not worth living. And you can see in that description, it's really a descendant of eugenics. That's where it comes from. And also, yeah, well, the other thing we need is some urgent attention to workforce development. We have I want to say a bit about structural and systemic ableism, just a couple of examples, because it is, we've got it in any data about deprivation or socioeconomic, disabled people at the bottom. So much of our physical or political or other environments, information environments, are not accessible to everybody. Any support or work that is out there is rationed, whether it's in schools or in the community. Everything is rationed. It's not there as of right. And there's a lack of interest and representation of disability anywhere. If it's theoretically 24% of New Zealanders identify as having a long-term impairment, where are they? Where are they? And all these processes, we don't have data. Apart from that, the census questions have changed, so we're going to get worse information. We disrespect disability everywhere, and that is structural, systemic ableism. And it's not for lack of trying, particularly by disability advocates themselves. We have the aspirational, the New Zealand Disability Strategy of 2001, which, quote, underpinning the New Zealand Disability Strategy is a vision of a fully inclusive society. New Zealand will be inclusive when people with impairments can say they live in a society that highly values our lives and continually enhances our full participation. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which New Zealand has ratified in 2008. We can't read these, but here are some of the articles. The convention describes what these look like in real life. I think we would be pushed to actually meet any of them. maybe we've had attempts at some of them. So I think we really need that apology from the top for this whole over a century of eugenic-based state policies targeting disabled children, young people and adults. It was wrong, it was unjust, and its legacy lingers in ongoing reports of disability, discrimination and abuse. But there is one bright point, it was mana whakaha, I might come back to, somebody might ask about. Anyhow, I just want to leave the last word to Robert, who is a hero. And this is a picture of him at the United Nations during the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where he spoke on behalf of Inclusion International, where I think he was a vice president. And his quote is, "Though it's great that New Zealand closed its last institution, Kimberley Centre, being institutionalised is not just about the buildings, the bricks and mortar. It is also about values, beliefs, actions and activities. It's about the way things are done, the decisions that are made, who makes them, and who has the control. In New Zealand, we still need to work hard to ensure that people with disabilities do not continue to be institutionalised, even though they live in community settings." So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have some additional questions for Dr. Stace, so I don't know whether you want to take a break now. We're just about at your 90-minute, or we could continue a little longer.
I think probably we should take the break so as to keep within the 90 minutes that we set out, and we'll return that equal bit a bit early after lunch has occurred.
Dr. Stace, going back to first principles, is there a shared understanding of disability? Can you describe that?
Sorry. I would say there probably isn't a shared understanding. The language has changed a lot over time. In New Zealand, we use the definition from the disability strategy that I mentioned about that people are disabled by their environments and attitudes. So disability is political, basically. The UN Convention uses persons with disabilities because that's people first language, so that's another way. But a shared understanding, there are a lot of different diagnoses and they change over time. So yes, it's quite hard to, at this time and place, we'd probably have quite different understandings than we would have had, say, in 1950 of what disability is. And there's new diagnoses happening all the time.
Would a shared understanding or definition assist with... It's gone off, sorry. Would a shared understanding or definition of disability assist in research and understanding of disability?
Definitely social model, which is the disabled person, the person disabled by their environment. That is really our official New Zealand interpretation. So the other model, what it replaced was the individual model, where disability or impairment was located in the individual and was an individual problem. So a social model approach, regardless really of the language used, is what we really need. So people are not individually deficient. Society is deficient for not including them.
You spoke quite a lot about eugenics in your evidence. Is there still a residue or impact in society today?
Yes, definitely. I heard Boris Johnson the other day saying something about poverty was caused by bad genes. So we hear a lot of the language of certain groups not allowed to breed on talkback radio. There's that sort of language is quite common around the place. Certain groups are, sort of the hints are that they are genetically the problem. There's a lot of that sort of language. But it's the ableist attitudes, and ableism is a descendant of eugenics that I mentioned before, being widespread, that really provides that basis for eugenics, for whatever we call it, to still thrive in various attitudes, and just basic things like all disability support is rationed, so there's nothing as of right, really. So disabled people using the social model of disability definition are still seen as not fully human, basically. And that's a eugenic attitude.
And so moving from that to education, at paragraph 50 of your brief, you talk about abuse and neglect in education. Is there anything that you would like to say further about that, and is there an article that you would like to produce as an exhibit?
I did co-write an article for the Policy Quarterly a few years ago with Giovanni Tiso, and it was about special education and how schools are almost penalised financially and otherwise by being inclusive. So although we have the 1989 Education Act, Section 8, which legislates for all children to be able to attend their local school from 5 to 19 years, full day, it is the reality for many, many children. That's not the reality. They're either persuaded to go to another school down the road, or they're only allowed to attend a couple of hours a day. But the schools that are trying hard to be inclusive, it costs more to support those children properly than the funding allows. So we have these magnet schools, so-called, because it's got a nice inclusive environment and philosophy of belonging, but it's hard for a lot of those schools. It's easier for schools to quietly persuade families to enrol their children in another school. And that's so widespread. There's social media, Facebook pages of parents every day facing discrimination against their children.
Education is for everyone unless you are special, as exhibit number 8, I think. And you spoke also about education in seclusion rooms. Are they still a part of the system?
After families finding that schools were using them, I think it was about 3 years ago, and again the media exposed that. The law was changed, I think early in 2017, maybe 16, to outlaw seclusion rooms as such. Also, there were a whole lot of new guidelines brought in about what you could do about restraint. So theoretically, we have no seclusion rooms. I suspect that timeout rooms of all sorts of styles are still being used, and I note that some teachers are complaining about the restraint guidelines as being too prescriptive. So I think all these things, there needs to be a lot more transparency in schools about actually what's happening, to look a bit deeper, because the seclusion rooms in those schools were there for years without anybody knowing or saying that they were there. So I think with all these things, ongoing vigilance is required, and I think it was quite sad that I think I'm right about this, and the seclusion rooms were mainly in the special schools already, so we already have the schools where the children are almost they're not in their local communities, they go somewhere else for a special environment. And that's where, yes, I think that's where the seclusion room's mainly turned up. So again, it's vigilance, inclusion, and transparency. Really important to not let those things creep back in.
And following on from those recommendations or suggestions, are there any other changes that you think New Zealand should be considering in terms of disabled persons' inclusion in the community and to prevent abuse?
And not just education and
Not
the
just
community generally.
community.
There's just so many ways it can be approached. I mean, you know, it's resourcing, it's having a system whereby parents parents are pretty savvy. They know when there is something different about their children, quite often, and they seek help. Huge waiting lists, if is there any help. Everything is rationed. So it's a slow process to get the support, if the support even exists. So I would suggest some system whereby children, when they have something identified, even before the diagnosis, because a diagnosis can take ages, parents know, they know, I need extra help with their child. It might not be something that's actually clinically diagnosed, but they need help with their child. Just like we used to have the Karatani nurses when, you know, mothers got a bit stressed. There needs to be something in the community that can help with families going through that stress. And if the child does end up with some kind of diagnosis, some wraparound system that probably goes with that child for their whole life throughout all the transitions. They can change the personnel of it, but something that is unique to that child, not fashioned. You know, there's been some ideas and principles and attempts at doing these things over the years, but they don't seem to last or be funded properly.
I think we just need to slow down a little bit, but thank you for that. And you've heard that Judge Carolyn Henwood spoke on Tuesday about how the Confidential Listening Assistance Service had tried to reach out to include the disabled community and felt they had failed. Not many stories had been heard. Do you have any suggestions that this Royal Commission could consider in light of trying to be inclusive?
Yes. Well, considering that a lot of the people who were experienced abuse in the psychopedic and other hospitals are no longer with us, we really have to make an effort to find those who are survivors and still with us. Realistically, that could be a group home of, say, Kimberley ex-residents, maybe minimally verbal, living in a place where their provider may know nothing about their past. So it's no good just telling a provider organisation this Royal Commission exists. It has to be something that goes and finds people. It takes time to build that relationship of knowledge and trust and get the stories in an environment that suits them. And I think there's some examples in the Extraordinary Stories book by Spectrum Care a few years ago that Bridget referred to. They did actually find some stories, even people who they'd had no sort of history. There's an example in the Templeton work of Jabbit, I think his name is, who was one of the survivors, the survivors from Templeton, who is very able to tell his story. If somebody went to Christchurch, went to his group home, built a relationship, he would have a wealth of information to tell, but it has to be person-centred, suit him through intermediaries. Can be done, but it's time-consuming for each one, but it really needs to be done. Otherwise, they just won't go and knock on the door of the building in Featherston Street and say, I'm here, listen.
Thank you. And question on you've talked about some things that have happened post-institutionalisation, but if you were to characterise the state of the nation now, what would you say?
We've had lots of good intentions. We've had endless reports into the health system and the education system. Things come and go. There is a good... I'm quite heartened by the latest program that's under development. It's a prototype called Mana Whakaha, which is in mid-central health, and it's based on the Enabling Good Lives principles, which were developed by disabled people themselves a few years ago. It's governed, run by disabled people. The trouble is, though, that once you provide something really good, a lot more people come out of the woodwork and want it, so therefore you have the funding constraints, falls over again. And it's only one area. It might be years till it's rolled out. But there are good intentions and there are good people trying to do good things, but it really has to be systemic and wrap around an individual.
And final area of my questioning is at paragraph 3 of your brief, you talk about having had 2 contracts with the Human Rights Commission in 2013 and 2014. Can you elaborate on what they involved and any reports that emanated from that work?
I think there's been concern in the Human Rights Commission for decades about this work, and I think Ros Noonan's coming to speak next week, and she was involved as Commissioner in one big report, which didn't ever get published. Then in 2013 there was that had all come under OPCAP, by the way, so it didn't come under UNCRPD. There was in the business plan for 2013, there was one line saying, ensure there is a review of historic abuse in state care to inform state care and welfare services delivered in New Zealand today. And I had a small part-time job, more or less doing a stock take of what had gone on, what was the state of everything was. There was an idea that there were a whole lot of files that MSD had that could be looked at to see systemic abuse, and that was the initial thing, but I think that was ruled out because we knew there was abuse, and 2, the abusers are not going to say in the file, I abused X last night, write it down for somebody in 30 years to find. So I did a bit of a stock take. I started with a what I call a kaitiaki group of Robert Martin, a survivor, Robin Hunt, who was an ex-commissioner, who else was on that? Anyhow, Anne Helm was on that too. So we sort of decided what we could do in a very short time, and we had a round table in June of 2014, which all sorts of people were invited, government agencies, individuals who were working in the area, psychiatrists who'd been working at lawyers. We had this great round table of about 50 people, and the idea was to spark something, because that contract was ending, and to spark something that would be ongoing. So there was it wasn't popular with the government, shall I say that. So, yeah, nothing much happened afterwards.
Report that you've talked about, which was Project Ensure There is a Review of Historic Abuse in State Care to inform state care and welfare services delivered in New Zealand today. Could we please produce that as an exhibit, which will be Exhibit 9, but I will just take Dr. Stace through a couple of the issues before turning you over to the commissioners. In that report, Do the commissioners, would you like a hard copy?
Yes, please.
Just very briefly, just to highlight some aspects of the report. So the first thing that you did in your report was to set out a timeline from the 1990s through to October 2013 about actions that had been taken in relation to historic abuse claims.
Yes.
And you then have some conclusions on page 5 of your report.
Yes, they were from March 2014, and there's just some, after that there are just some appendices. I don't have any written material after March 2014, although the roundtable didn't take place until June.
And can you just go through the appendices, which are on page 6, and outline the purpose of collecting that data?
Well, it was just, we wanted to know, well, I was employed in a very part-time capacity to find out really what had happened over the decades, and the then Chief Human Rights Commissioner had some questions about what had happened, and so we dug up correspondence, and there were various other things like the Broad report. Howard Broad's report had been useful. Various emails from people who had been, I mean, this work's been, the push towards this work's gone on for decades, so there is a long history, including in places like the Human Rights Commissioner. And am I allowed to say how, you know, when Commissioner Gibson was there, he did a lot of work to try and get a focus on historic abuse when he was at the Human Rights Commission at this time.
And the correspondence that you collected that's annexed to this report, how would you characterise the views of the Human Rights Commission versus those of the government of the day?
Well, there is a letter there from the Attorney General who is quite disrespectful of the earlier work that had been done. And I mean, yes, I don't know how government works, but I think it's quite hard to go on with a project once you've been almost shut down by your superiors.
And can you just describe what involvement, if any, you had subsequent to producing this document?
When I finished with this this contract, I didn't really, apart from continuing to promote the work in this area, and I'd met quite a few people as a result of that roundtable and worked out, you know, what they were doing and their interests. So I sort of had some informal conversations with people, but from then on it was just to push advocacy for a committee, a Royal Commission, something to look at historic abuse. So it was constant, the push for this, as it had been for decades, and I think it was announced actually by Jacinda Ardern at Lizzie Stanley's book launch about the end of 2016, that she said if she was in government they would finally have one, which was not, the government of the day thought what was already there was sufficient, that there were no new cases. Well, there wasn't legal aid anymore, but also the processes that were existing already was sufficient. It wasn't needed to do anything. They did extend class for another couple of years, but they took money from MSD, Ministry of Ed and Ministry of Health to do that.
And the view that you've just outlined, that everything was fine and working well, is captured in the documents in that report.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Stace. I have no further questions, but Mr. Chair, I would like to ask for an interim Section 15 order for this report, primarily because there is some litigation that is named. I don't know the status of whether there are any suppression orders that may attach to that. So on balance of caution, I would ask that any litigation or proceedings names are given a non-publication order. There are also names of staff members who are not in senior roles, as I understand it, within the organisations, and so would not have had an expectation that they would be named in public. And so I would also ask for a non-publication order for staff members in non-senior roles within the organisations mentioned throughout the report.
Thank you. I've been looking at the document as Dr. Stace has been referring to it. Sorry. I have been looking at the document as Dr. Stace has been speaking and referring to it, and I can see the thrust of the application that you make. Can I ask if there is any objection to a Section 15 order being made by the Commission? There isn't? Well, in that event, my colleague, Judge Shaw, has just intimated to me a slight reservation about the term not senior roles. It seems to be a rather broad and vague definition. Is there any other formulation of words that would cover the position?
One is not seeking non-publication of people in chief executive or senior leadership roles. So people within the claims unit or operational roles would not expect that. Normally in OIA applications, their names are redacted.
If I could just make it clear, it's just being able, I get the point, and I support the notion of non-publication to protect those people. It's just the way it's described, and you've just said it, I think. People other than the chief executive, and what was the other?
Senior leadership roles.
And senior leadership roles.
Yes, well, that seems to cover it in a better way.
Thank you.
Right. Well, having regard to the application that you make, can I enter into the record as follows? The inquiry has been asked by counsel assisting to make an interim order under Section 15 of the Inquiries Act 2013 to prohibit publication of the names of legal proceedings. This is to avoid any inadvertent breach of suppression or other orders, as well as the names of any staff members, to protect their privacy where the roles they are or were employed in were other than that of chief executive or senior leadership roles. In other words, being people who had a reasonable expectation that they would not be publicly named.
I'm obliged, sir. Thank you.
Having considered the application and reviewed the matters the inquiry ought to consider under Section 15(2) of the Act, though the order that you seek is made. Thank you.
I'm obliged. Thank you to the Commission. I have no further questions and will turn Dr. Stace.
Thank you. I'm now going to, first of all, ask Council whether anyone wishes to exercise a right of cross-examination of Dr. Stace. I will then ask my colleagues if there are any questions, and in the middle there is a little thing that I would like to say. First of all, Council. There are no questions. The thing that I wish to say, Dr. Stace, is that in addition to your brief, which runs to 22 pages, there is what I consider to be a prodigious bibliography of material which itself runs to 5 pages. I just want to record in public the usefulness that material is and will be for the Royal Commission as it considers your evidence along with other matters, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can I then ask if any of my colleagues wishes to ask you any questions? First of all, Ms. Alofi, Mr. Gibson.
Kia ora, Dr. Stace, and thank you for the amazing presentation. My first question is about, I suppose, the current cultural backdrop, whether it facilitates abuse and neglect. And just comparing, you use, I suppose, racism and ableism both falling out of something historically eugenics, and where I think everybody understands and finds racism appropriately abhorrent. Ableism, I suppose, manifests itself in different ways. To what extent should we find it abhorrent, and to what extent is it pervasive today?
Well, discrimination is bad, whatever you label it, and whatever the target group is, and there's often, racism and ableism will go together. I don't think there's a big understanding of ableism. I don't think people reflect on maybe some ableist attitudes that we all have. I think I just think it's all abhorrent, because all those discriminations, the isms, see other humans as not fully human, not fully deserving of rights, agency, dignity, all those sort of things. I'm not sure if that's what you meant.
Yes, thanks. I know some of the things that have been happening in Australia. I'm looking for your comment on those. They've undergone quite a huge transformation of their disability support system, a huge increase in resources. I suppose 2 questions. To what extent does New Zealand require that or not to ensure people are safe from abuse and neglect and care?
Do you mean sorry?
Actually, I'll let that first.
Do you mean the NDIS?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the NDIS, the ideas came from the Julia Rudd government, I guess, about a decade ago, and we all thought how wonderful, and they came to New Zealand and we all talked to them. The trouble with it, and this was going to be sort of an ACC type system with levies, I think, but the trouble is each state could make their own priorities and do it their own way. As time's gone on, the eligibility criteria has got much tougher. It's harder. It doesn't do under 8-year-olds, which seems ridiculous. And there's, I think, widespread disappointment that the promise hasn't made much. I mean, some people, okay, but actually it's still flawed, and it's because it's subject to rationing and funding. Again, which is what the problem is. I think personally what I would like to see in New Zealand is some alignment of ACC, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Social Development to have one universal, equitable, fair system of disability support and income support. And I think we could lead the world on doing that. The NDIS, great idea, a bit of a disappointment.
Secondly, I'm aware Australia had a institutional responses to child sexual abuse commission, much bigger resource-wise than what we're doing here, 373 million. One of the outcomes of that was increased awareness of the extent of sexual abuse against disabled children, which wasn't appreciated prior to that. A few years down the track, there's an even bigger inquiry in terms of disability, violence, abuse, exploitation and neglect. 527 million Australian dollars, so on a scale even much bigger than the child sexual abuse. What lessons do you take from what's gone on in Australia in the last years about violence and abuse against disabled people?
That last, was it a Royal Commission, the people, some of them came to New Zealand, was it last year, told us about it, and the man I talked to said they didn't really think about disability when they started looking at sexual abuse, and at the end, one volume of whatever they had, 40 volumes, was on disability, and they, there's a problem here. Well, we know that. I really like the one they're doing now. They've just started. It's live streaming some of the hearings, only just started doing some public hearings. I really, really like that focus on disability only, because in anything else, no reflection or disrespect to anybody, we know disability is sidelined. It's not interesting, people don't really relate to it, they feel uncomfortable. Unless there is a primary focus on disability and disability abuse, it is always at risk of being sidelined. Abuse, support for disabled kids, support for disabled adults, support for disabled aged people. It's always going to be sidelined unless there is a primary focus, unless people are really, really concerned to make it a strong focus of whatever work is underway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Stace, and thank you very much for the considered and meticulous way in which you presented your evidence. My question really arises out of what really struck me was the systemic issues that constantly compound and actually leads to the deterioration really of the journey of the disabled person through the system. And earlier on in the week, Judge Carolyn Henwood spoke about a separate independent entity or an authority of some sort that could actually receive the complaints specifically, so that people could feel they could come forward to actually kind of get some grievance or to get some redress around some of those grievances. And I like what you're saying about the lack of alignment, because that's what continues to confound. Any views on that?
Yes, well, when we had the Select Committee in 2008, I think one of the recommendations was for a disability commissioner, which would do some of those things. I remember the Cartwright inquiry of the 80s, and we thought, hooray, the Health and Disability Commission is going to be the answer. Well, 2 years to get it's not working as we thought it might. I think some sort of a disability commissioner, as well as the one on the Human Rights Commission. So one with its own office that can do investigations, that can hold government to account, independent officer of Parliament, all those things. I would like, and it was a recommendation in 2008, and I think that said, if other things don't work, we'll look at it again. I think it might be time to look at it again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any further question of you myself, but I now ask my colleague Judge Shaw and then Dr. Erueti.
Thank you, Stace. I'm very grateful for your evidence, but I have no other questions for you.
Tēnā Dr. Stace. I was going to ask Sandra, Commissioner, I love your vice question. I have another on my sleeve, but I wanted to just thinking in the institutional environment about are we still seeing the features of institutionalism in effect. I wonder whether there's been an increased burden or responsibility, it's a better way of putting it, placed on whānau and family. Could you just describe for me?
I think there is. I think any parent or family or whānau trying to support a child, particularly one who might have quite high needs, is really, really hard. There are different mechanisms. You can be a fund holder, but the work, we really need some concentration on workforce, and the workforce has to be very professional. It has to have high status, which it doesn't have now. It has to be a career, so you can be a, whatever you call it, personal assistant or carer. It needs to be something that people want to do, and you know, has career development, code of ethics, good union, all those sort of things, and highly professional. And I think that would be a start. So that when parents either, you know, need support to have their child at home, or they're in a residential placement of some kind, they can have confidence that that child, who is an adult, who will be an adult when they die, which is a huge worry from parents, you know, my generation, that they can have confidence that there is that professionalism of the career of disability support worker. So you don't have to be constantly vigilant. You don't have to constantly worry about, you know, are they getting fed? Do they go and do anything in the community? Are they just getting barely babysat and that's all? You know, so I think a huge, strong focus on workforce would be a really good thing to do. And I don't think anybody's actually doing it, I mean, with all the other work programs. But that's, I think, would help, because there are a lot of people living with their parents or not too far away. We don't really we hardly have any residential options in the old institution sense. There's a few, but not many. Mostly people are living in sort of group homes or one-on-one homes, single-person homes.
Thank you. Just one last question about the redress schemes. Dr. Stace, I wonder about accessibility for people with learning disabilities to the redress schemes offered by MSD, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. You did mention earlier about the need for a commissioner on disabilities, and perhaps that could provide that service. Do
you mean going through the current processes that you can go through the
yes, through, for example, the MSD historical claims unit.
Yeah, historical claims, I think education and, certainly support is required. I think that's just a matter of, people won't know that they can do that. People don't know that their experience might have been abusive because it was the norm. Families, we need to, and this is my little thing, I want to say, I wish the Royal Commission hears from staff, from families. The survivors are important, but in disability, a lot of them are no longer with us, but there are still scarred families. There are still staff members who are horrified at what they saw and had to do. But yes, I think a disability. I think you've probably got expertise here at the Commission to know how to do that in a very respectful way. It's a matter of finding people, walking with them, building a relationship, and going through that process.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stace. Thank you for your evidence and your willingness to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stace. You're excused.